Greetings. Let us learn a little more about the differences between various endoscopes that we use in our practice. In order to find out, all you have to do is walk into the endoscope storage area and look at the cupboards and see the differences between the gastroscopes, single channel, double channel, colonoscopes, adult, pediatric and slim, and enteroscopes. As you can see, there is a difference in the length of the insertion tube between the gastroscopes and colonoscopes and between the colonoscopes and the enteroscopes. You also notice that there is a difference in the caliber of the scope. So, we will go into the details as we discuss it next. So, let us move to the specialty scopes, duodenoscopes and endoscopic ultrasound scopes. So, let us look at the specific differences. First is the insertion tube working length. So, that is the length of the tube that you could insert, and it determines how far down or up the gut can you go in. So, let us look at the various insertion tube lengths of different scopes. The gastroscopes are anywhere between 103 to 110 centimeters, colonoscopes between 133 to 168 centimeters, enteroscope 200 centimeters, duodenoscope or ERCP scope is about 124 centimeters, and about the same length is the ultrasound scope. So, say for example, you have a patient with a very long stomach and your gastroscope is not able to reach into the distal portion of the duodenum. You could use a longer instrument, either a colonoscope or an enteroscope. Secondly, if you are planning to do an examination of the jejunum, typically we need an enteroscope with about 200 centimeters in length, but if you do not have that instrument in your practice, you could pick up a colonoscope which is longer than a gastroscope, and you could reach the jejunum and examine the jejunum. So, that is why this is important to know the lengths of different scopes. Sometimes a typical colonoscope may not be adequate to reach the cecum. In such cases, one may use a longer scope, and that is an enteroscope, which is 200 centimeters compared to 168 centimeters with the colonoscope to reach the cecum. So, it is important to know the difference in the working channel length among these scopes. Next is the insertion tube diameter. So, this is the insertion tube diameter. Scopes have different insertion tube diameters, and let us look at the gastroscopes. Could be as small as 4.9 millimeters or 5 millimeters in size to as big as 10.9 millimeters. In between there are a couple more sizes, 5.8 and 9.9. For colonoscopes, again there are three different sizes. Slim is 9.5, pediatric is 11.8, and adult colonoscope is 12.8 millimeters. Enteroscopes are about the same size as a gastroscope or a slim colonoscope. Only thing is they are much longer. ERCP scope is about the size of 11.3 millimeters, and the US scope is depending upon the type, radial versus linear, 11.8 and 12.6 millimeters. Why is the insertion tube diameter important? Say for example, you have somebody with difficulty swallowing, and you start with an adult EGD scope which has a diameter of 10.9 millimeters, but the patient's esophageal lumen is 8 millimeters. So if you want to go down without causing damage, you could pick a slimmer upper GI scope, either 4.9 millimeters or 5.8 millimeters, and be able to go down the stricture and examine the area much better. Another issue is if you have somebody with a narrow colon from severe diverticulosis, or have had surgeries causing narrowing of the sigmoid colon, an adult scope of 12.8 millimeters may not be able to go through. In that case, you may want to pick a pediatric colonoscope, that is 11.8, or in some cases you may pick up a slim colonoscope, 9.5 millimeters in size. So it's important to figure out what are we dealing with. Is the patient going to have some difficulties due to narrowing of the lumen? In that case, you want to pick a scope that is smaller than the opening so that it can go through. Next is the endoscope channel diameter. This is the channel diameter, and as you can see here, this is an important bearing because it is helpful for suction. Bigger the channel, bigger the suction, and bigger the channel, bigger the instruments that can go through a particular channel. So let us look at the channel diameter of different scopes. Gastroscopes, slimmer scopes tend to have a smaller channel of 2 millimeters. An adult gastroscope has a channel of 3.7 millimeters. Most of the instruments that are developed by the manufacturers are anywhere between 2.2 to 3.7 millimeters in size or less, so that these can go through a gastroscope. For a colonoscope, the channels are a little bit bigger than the gastroscope, 3.2 to 3.7, and enteroscope, because it's a smaller caliber scope, the lumen is smaller, 2.8. ERCP scope, we put lots of big stents through that, and they have a bigger channel, 4.2 millimeters. And EUS scope has 3.7 millimeters. It is important to check, depending upon the manufacturer of a particular scope, you may notice differences in insertion length, diameter of the insertion tube, and the channel diameter. But it's important to keep this thing in mind when you're assisting somebody. Say for example, you are going into a stomach that is filled up with blood clots in somebody who has had GI bleeding, and you want to suction that. It's better to pick up a scope with a bigger channel diameter so that you can suction those clots easier. Next is the field of view. As you can see here, how far can you see on either side? So when you look at the field of view, gastroscope has a field of view of 120 to 140 degrees, and colonoscopes have much wider field of view, 140 to 170 degrees. Enteroscope about the same as a pediatric colonoscope, and ERCP scope has 100 degrees, EUS scope about 100 degrees. As you can see here, when you use a colonoscope, an adult colonoscope, you have much larger field of view. So something to keep in mind for screening purposes. Finally, let's look at the bending section of the scope, bending up and down and right and left. So this is important for certain situations, and let us look at the bending section of different scopes, up and down, left and right. Gastroscope has a maximum up bending angle of 210 degrees, and then down 90, left and right 100. And colonoscope overall has 180 up, 180 down, 160 left, 160 right. Endoscope about the same. ERCP scope, you have to look down to enter into the duodenum. So they tend to have much larger downward deflection than the upward deflection. And again, for US scopes, they have 130 to 190 or 180 to 90 degrees. So let's look at this, and why is this important to know the bending section. So say for example, you are taking care of a lesion high up in the stomach where you need to deflect your tip all the way up. You should check your scope and make sure it is able to flex all the way up with a maximum of 210 degrees so that you could reach those areas and manage the problem. That's why it's important to check what type of scope you need. Whether the patient is having a narrow lumen, then you pick up a slimmer scope. If the patient is having issues that need to cleared up or suction, then a bigger channel. And then if you have an anatomy that needs a lot of angulation changes, then a gastroscope is something that needs to be picked up. I hope you appreciate the differences in various scopes and the different issues that could be addressed by picking up the best scope based on the length, insertion tube diameter, channel diameter, and bending section. Thank you.